Today I'm sharing a beginner's step-by-step guide to water bath canning. I personally have over 10 years of experience, and I learned from a master canner, hands-on, in person, but not everyone has access to that, and so I want to be there for people who learn better hands-on to teach you all of the safe procedures and the equipment you need to know to get started. Water bath canning includes jams, jellies, chutneys, ketchups, and sauces, as well as pickles and anything that is high acid. Whereas pressure canning is a procedure that you can use to pressure can soups, spaghetti sauces that have meat, or any kind of meat or low acid vegetable. And so I might make a separate video on that, but for today, it's water bath canning. And this is a really great skill because you can make all of your own condiments and jams, and it's just a fabulous, life-giving skill. And so I'm getting started today with some strawberry jam. I'm not focusing on the recipe, I'm focusing on the canning procedure. So these strawberries were picked the night before, sliced and put with sugar for a process called maceration. And that helps draw the juices out, and it blends the juices with the sugars. And now it's ready to get boiling and canning. And I'm starting with a heavy bottom stainless steel pot. And you always want to use stainless steel, not aluminum. And so I'm getting started with that. And I'm going to be getting that up to a boil. And you always want to use freshly harvested vegetables or fruit. Canning is a procedure that needs to stay consistent because there is a lot of safety involved. And so I always follow the exact same steps, the exact same procedures, and I always set up my workstation in the exact same way so that it's just streamlined and I know exactly what I'm doing. So I usually set out a heavy sort of wooden cutting board or something that you can put hot jars onto. And then I line that with a clean cloth. And then I get all of my tools out and my jars. I'm using new canning jars today, and they come with lids and rings. But by all means, you can buy used canning jars, sterilize them, and it's really easy to buy the lids and the rings separately. And one of the great things is that you can reuse the jars. So it's very zero waste. Now getting started, we need a canning funnel. We need a jar lifter, a lid lifter that has a magnet on it. And I'm missing the fourth tool that you use to get the bubbles out of your jars, but I just use sort of a chopstick or something of the sort. And then you also, if you're using reusable jars, then you need to buy lids, and they come in two different sizes, large and small. And old jars had another size called gem, which was kind of an in-between. And I do have some gem jars, but it's hard to get your hands on the gem lids. And then if you're reusing jars, then you also need rings. And rings are something that you can also reuse, just like the jars. So the only thing you need to keep buying are actually the lids. So you can save a lot of money by canning and save a lot of waste to the landfill as well. Now I'm getting started here with washing my jars, and even though they're brand new, I still want to wash them thoroughly in hot soapy water. And I'm also washing the lids and the rings, and then I'm going to be putting the lids into a pot with hot water and getting that on the stove on a low temperature. They don't need to boil, but keeping them warm will help them seal. Now, there are a couple of different ways that you can sterilize your jars. You can boil them for 15 minutes. I put mine in the oven, and you can put them at 275 for 10 to 15 minutes. 10 minutes should be sufficient, but I usually do 15. Or you can use a dishwasher. I don't have a dishwasher, and I don't like putting jars into a pot of boiling water because I already have so much going on the stove. So I really prefer the oven method because I can get a lot of jars into my oven at once. As my jam is heating up and boiling, I'm getting everything else ready to go. And I'm also going to be getting my canning pot on the stove and heating that up. I personally use my pressure canner as a water bath canner. And you can really use any pot as long as it's tall enough that you can fit an inch of water above your jars. And it needs to have a rack on the bottom because that gives a cushion of safety for your jars so that they don't break on you. And getting started, I'm filling up my canner halfway full of water because I need that inch of water above my jars when they're canning. And the jars themselves will raise the level of that water. So I'm getting started with halfway up. And because this pot is too big to fit in my sink, I use mason jars and I just keep carrying more and more water over until I have it halfway full. And then I just get that heating up. Here is my Bernardin Home Preserving book. Now, I personally like to use vintage and old recipes sometimes. And I like to use this book as a cross-reference for all of the headspace and canning times and everything I need to know in order to do that safely. And I don't recommend using vintage recipes unless you have more experience with canning, because you need to know what is currently safe and not safe. Some older recipes will use ingredients we don't use now. If you're new to canning and you're on the lookout for a water bath canner, just make sure to check the size because I've seen a lot of small ones on the market and they really only fit pint-sized jars. You really need a tall canner in order to do quarts because you need that inch of headspace. So just keep that in mind. And I'm bringing up some extra jars because I really want to make sure that I have enough jars because I don't know how much jam I'm going to be getting. So it's always safe to have extra sterilized jars on hand just in case you have more than you expected. And in my case, I did end up with more, so I'm really glad that I did that. It's really important when you're canning that all of your surfaces are clean and all of your utensils and tools are clean and even sterilized. I don't sterilize my plastic tools because I actually tried that and they melted. So I don't bother with sterilizing those, but it's just really important that everything is really clean. Canning can take a few hours, and so you really want to make sure that when you're canning, you have enough time available to do it. And I know a lot of people don't can just because it is time consuming, but come winter, it's going to be so nice to have jars of jams and jellies and all kinds of things that you have on hand and you don't have to buy from the store anymore. I personally haven't had to buy any canned tomatoes or pasta sauce in over 2 years. So it's really wonderful. So I have one batch of sterilized jars and another batch going in. And my jam is now ready to go. It took quite a while and a lot of boiling, but it's ready to get put in the jars. I just need to skim off the foam and I'll be ladling these into the jars. Now, one thing that's really, really important is you always want to go from hot to hot. So a hot jam or a hot product into a hot jar and into hot water that's already heated in your canner. There's also a method called cold packing where you're putting a cold product into a cold jar and then your water in your canner also needs to be cold. Now for my jam, I need a 1/4 inch headspace. The bottom ring is 1 inch And then if you look at the rings, there's a halfway point and then another side that it's a little bit higher. That is the 1/4 inch mark. You always want to follow the instructions for your headspace, and headspace is really important. So don't neglect that. So I'm putting a 1/4 inch headspace onto my jams. And a lot of other things have an inch or a half an inch depending, but jam is a 1/4 of an inch. And then I need to wipe my rims of my jars just in case there's any jam on there, because we want to have a really good seal. And then I'm putting my hot lids on, and then my ring needs to be twisted to fingertip tight. So you twist it until you feel resistance, and then you just go as far as you can with your fingertips. And that's ready to go into the canner. And I'm going to show you another time. So I'm ladling the hot jam into the jar, leaving a 1/4 inch headspace. And I'm using that funnel to make sure that I don't get jam all over the place. And then I'm using a little skewer to get any air bubbles out. Now my set did come with a tool for that. You don't want to use anything metal. So air bubbles out, and then check your headspace again. Wipe the rims. And if you lost headspace, you need to add a little bit more jam. If it's okay, then you wipe the rim, and I'm using a little bit of water with vinegar in it and a paper towel. And then I'm putting my lid on and a ring, and I'm going to fingertip tight. And then I'm using my jar lifter and putting that into the canner. And you just keep following the same procedure with every single jar, always making sure to get any air bubbles out, always checking your headspace. You always need to wipe those rims and even the edges of the jar, just to make sure that there is no food on there, because if there's any jam or any food on that lid, it can actually prevent it from fully sealing, and we wouldn't want that. And I'm using a paper towel to wipe those rims. I also like to use cheesecloth for that. And I keep moving my paper towel around so that I'm not using the same spot to wipe again and again. And so we just keep doing the same procedure, not forgetting any of the steps. Putting our lid onto the jar, and because it's nice and warm, it's going to seal really nicely. And then putting our ring onto fingertip tight, making sure it's not over tightened, and you also don't want it too loose because it can actually loosen while it's canning. Now I have a jar here that I overfilled, and so in that case, I'm just using a spoon and taking some of it out because we want to keep that 1/4 inch headspace precisely. Now, no matter what we're canning, we're always following these exact same steps. And there were not really any air bubbles with this jam, but some things can actually have quite a few air bubbles, especially bigger things like pickles, and bigger pieces of vegetables can actually have quite a few air bubbles. So that's a really important step. So we're always following this exact same procedure every single time we're canning, no matter what it is that we're canning. Pressure canning also follows these same steps. It's just a different procedure for the pressure canning, but it still follows these same sterilization steps and the exact same steps for cleanliness and checking your headspace and air bubbles. My canner is full, and so I'm ready to get started. And I'm just ensuring that there is that inch of water to cover the jars, which there is, but you need to make sure that you have an inch of water covering. And then I'm using this separate lid, not the lid that comes with my pressure canner, because I want it to be able to let some of the steam escape. And so that's that. And I'm getting some more jars out so that I can start filling more jars. Now I've got my canner on high heat and I'm getting it up to a rolling boil. And we don't start timing our canning until it's at that rolling boil. And jam is supposed to go for 10 minutes, but according to your altitude, you might need to increase the time. And so my altitude indicates that I need to add an extra 5 minutes for anything that I can. And so I'm going for 15 minutes. So that's something that you're going to want to check depending on where you live. It's really easy to just do a Google search and check your altitude. And then most canning books will tell you canning times for altitudes. So just check on that. And that's all you really need to know. So I'm putting my filled jars back into my oven. My oven's turned off, but I'm just keeping them warm in there because you always want the hot jars going into a hot canner. And now I'm cleaning up my space and getting it ready for the jars when they come out. I had just a little bit of jam left over, and that's going to go into my fridge to get used right away because you really need to have that precise headspace. So you can't can a jar that just has a little bit in it like that. So now I'm turning my canner off after my 15 minutes, and we need to let this sit with the heat turned off for 5 minutes. And after 5 minutes, we're going to remove them from the canner, and I'm putting them onto my prepared cutting board. And we want them having space in between each other. So you don't want them right up against each other. You want to allow room for them to breathe, and because they're going to have a lot of heat coming off of them. So it really didn't take long to can these jars of jam, only 15 minutes. It really took a lot more time to get everything set up and to get my jam cooked down. These jars need to sit undisturbed for about 24 hours to cool completely. You don't want to move them around, and that's going to help them also seal correctly because they're not always sealed when they come out, and you'll hear a little pop, and that means that they've just sealed. It's kind of fun to listen for that. So I'm getting my other jars into the canner. I only have 4 left, and I'm going to make sure my water level is correct and get those going. And then all of my jars are going to sit here overnight. Here we are the following morning, and I'm shooing the dogs out. And these jars have sat here overnight, which is sufficient. They're cooled off. And I can tell that they're sealed just by looking at the tops because the lids will either kind of be concaved upwards or concaved downwards. And if they're downwards, that means that they're sealed. But what I need to do is remove these rings. And we're not going to store them with those rings on because that can actually cause rust and it's just not good for your jars. I'm testing the seals by lifting them up by those lids. And if it's not sealed correctly, it'll just come right off. And luckily for me, all of my jars were sealed. That doesn't always happen. I definitely have jars that don't seal sometimes. And tipping them upside down like this can also put pressure on the lid. So if it's going to snap off, it'll do it when you do that. And then we're going to be cleaning our jars and especially focusing on the area where the ring was. And we want to clean just the whole entire jar. Now, I have skipped this step before and then ended up with food particles left on the jar that ended up molding in my canning room. And it's just kind of gross. You don't want that. So cleaning the jars thoroughly is an important step. And then when we're done cleaning the jars, we're going to let them dry so that we can mark the lids. And they need to be fully dry before you do that because your Sharpie pen won't work properly if you don't. Those lids are going to get washed in soapy water and then dried properly and then stored for next time. And if you ever end up with lids or rings that have rust on them, you need to dispose of them and get new ones. Now, our last step is marking our jars. Now, we want to put the contents and the date. And, when you're canning, a lot of times you'll have a few previous years of canned goods in your canning room. And so having the date tells you this was just canned. And we can also give this as gifts at Christmas time. And that's always a great thing to give. People love getting canned goods, and it's just better quality than anything you can buy at the store. Here are my finished jars, and I like to keep the boxes that the jars come in because they're handy to move your jars down to your canning room. Now here is that leftover jar of jam that we put in the fridge, and this is a really great way to test and see how it turned out. And so I can see that it gelled up nicely and the consistency is good. So it's nice to have a leftover like that just so you know what your canning will turn out like. So I'm putting this into another box so I can transport this safely down into my canning room. If you're new to my channel, I share content every week on food from scratch, homemaking, and life on our farm.